Morgan Freeman walked onto the set of The View that day with one purpose: to say what no one else in Hollywood dared to say. The producers thought they knew what they were getting: a legendary actor promoting his latest project, sharing nostalgic stories, and maybe offering a soundbite about his decades-long career. They had no idea what was coming. They had underestimated him. The bright, polished studio of The View was alive with the usual energy. Cameras rolled, the audience clapped on cue, and the host smiled, expecting another predictable segment. But as soon as Freeman leaned forward, his deep, deliberate voice cut through the scripted atmosphere like a blade. "You know, when I was a kid, we didn't see ourselves," he said, his words landing with the weight of a truth long ignored. Whoopi Goldberg, a veteran of these conversations, momentarily faltered, while the rest of the panel sat up straighter, sensing the shift in the air. "And when we did," Freeman continued, "we weren't the hero. We were the sidekick, the stereotype, the background." The audience, usually filled with chatter and polite laughter, was silent. This wasn't the conversation they had tuned in for, but it was a conversation they couldn't turn away from. Sunny Hostin, who had previously spoken about black narratives in media, looked ready to interject, but Freeman wasn't finished. "The problem hasn't disappeared," he said. "It's just evolved. Hollywood tells the stories it wants to tell, and history gets rewritten." His eyes locked onto Hostin as he spoke, his presence commanding attention. "You mentioned black battalions," he said, referencing an earlier episode, the soldiers who fought and died for this country. "But do you realize how little that story has actually been told?" Hostin opened her mouth, perhaps to soften the moment, perhaps to push back, but Freeman simply lifted a hand, not harshly, not dismissively, just firmly. "No disrespect," he said, "but this isn't about one film. It's about a pattern, a system. It's about how we've let entire generations grow up not knowing the full picture of our history." The tension in the room was thick. Joy Behar glanced at the producers, perhaps hoping for a signal to pivot the conversation. Alyssa Farr Griffin sat quietly observing. Sarah Haynes nervously checked her notes, likely wondering how things had veered so far off track. But there was no turning back now. Freeman wasn't finished, and everyone in the room knew it. He turned to the audience, his voice steady, deliberate. "Movies and television shape how we see ourselves, how we see each other. But when the only stories that get told are filtered through one lens, what happens to the rest of us?" The audience was hooked, unable to look away. "What happens to the kid who never sees himself as the hero?" Freeman asked, letting the question linger in the air. The weight of the moment was undeniable, and the applause that followed wasn't the polite kind daytime TV thrived on. It wasn't the canned approval encouraged by flashing cue cards. It was real. It was visceral. Even Whoopi, usually the most composed, shifted in her seat. "Morgan, you're right," she admitted, nodding slowly. "This is the kind of conversation we need to be having." But even as she spoke, an unspoken question hung in the air. How far would The View let this go? Freeman's expression didn't change. He wasn't looking for approval. He wasn't here to fit into their pre-planned segment. He had started something now, and whether they liked it or not, the conversation had shifted. What no one realized at that moment was that this was only the beginning. Because when you challenge the narratives that mainstream media protects, there are always consequences. And The View was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The producers of The View thought they could steer the conversation back to safer ground. That was their first mistake. Their second? Underestimating Morgan Freeman. Whoopi Goldberg, usually the show's anchor, was visibly uneasy. Joy Behar, always quick with a quip, forced a half smile. They had handled countless guests, managed heated debates, redirected uncomfortable discussions. But this was different. Freeman leaned back in his chair, his presence unshakable. "Hollywood has convinced itself it's telling the full story," he continued. "But that's the illusion. The stories that get greenlit, the ones that get amplified, they fit a certain narrative. And history gets rewritten." Joy Behar, sensing the danger, jumped in. "Well, we have plenty of stories about black history," she said, waving her hand. "I mean, minus 12 years a slave, Selma." Hidden Figures Freeman let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then, with the precision of a man who had spent his life delivering lines that held weight, he responded. "Those are stories about oppression," he said. "They matter. But where are the stories of triumph? Where are the stories where black men and women are the leaders? The innovators? The people shaping history in ways that don't revolve around suffering?" Behar hesitated, struggling for a response. Freeman turned to Hostin, his gaze unwavering. "You mentioned black battalions," he said again. But how many young people today even know about them? How many students have ever been taught about the Harlem Hellfighters, the men who fought in Fletcher, fought and sent to the front lines but denied respect when they came home? Austin blinked, her confidence shaken. I mean, there have been books, documentaries she started, but Freeman smiled slightly. There was no humor in it. Books, documentaries, but not in the mainstream, not in history classes, not in the movies that shape how we remember the past. The audience was hanging on every word. Whoopi exhaled, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Morgan, I get what you're saying, she said carefully. But isn't it also about what audiences will support? Hollywood is still a business. These films, Freeman cut in smoothly, his voice even. And who controls what audiences see, he asked. Who decides what gets marketed, what gets promoted? Because let me tell you something, people will watch what you give them. He continued. If you only serve one kind of story, that's what they'll expect. The audience murmured in agreement. The energy in the studio shifting yet again. Bihar crossed her arms, trying to regain ground. Okay, but let's not pretend Hollywood hasn't made progress, she said. Look at you, Morgan, she added, pressing forward. You've had an incredible career. If things were as bad as you're saying, would you have become who you are today? Freeman didn't even blink. You don't measure progress by the success of a few, he said. You measure it by the opportunity for all. The applause was immediate, but in the control room, panic set in, producers scrambled, headsets buzzing with frantic conversations. We need to pivot. This is going off the rails. Can we wrap this segment early? How do we spin this? But there was no spinning this. Not anymore. They had lost control, and they were about to make a fatal mistake. The applause was still echoing through the studio when the producers made their move. Without warning, the show cut to a commercial break, the transition so abrupt it sent ripples of confusion through the audience. People glanced at one another, unsure of what had just happened, while the hosts shifted in their seats, momentarily caught off guard. Whoopi Goldberg glanced toward the camera crew, while Joy Behar adjusted her microphone and Sunny Hostin flipped through her notes, as if searching for a transition that wasn't there. But Morgan Freeman didn't react. He simply sat back in his chair, watching with the calm of a man who had been in this business long enough to know exactly what had just happened. They were trying to regain control, but the damage had already been done. The studio lights dimmed slightly, the show's signature jingle played, and a bright pre-recorded advertisement flooded the screen. But behind the scenes, chaos erupted as producers scrambled to make sense of the situation. Headsets buzzed with frantic discussions as higher-ups debated how to spin the segment once they returned from the break. We need to pivot, one producer muttered, running a hand through their hair, while another voice chimed in. How do we soften this when we're back on air? A third producer, voice sharp with urgency, asked the question no one wanted to answer. Do we cut it short? Meanwhile, in the dressing rooms, assistants checked their phones, watching as Twitter exploded in real time. The hashtag Let Freeman Speak was already trending, and it was gaining momentum fast. Within minutes, thousands of tweets poured in, calling out The View for its obvious censorship. They cut him off because he was telling the truth. One tweet read, while another said, Freeman is out here educating people. And they panicked. But the most damning comments were the ones that framed this moment as proof that Hollywood carefully curates what gets said and what gets buried. Back on set, the tension was thick, and the countdown for the commercial break ticked down as the hosts prepared to return. Whoopi Goldberg tapped her fingers against the table, her face unreadable, while Joy Behar whispered something to Sunny, who nodded but didn't reply. Alyssa Farah Griffin sat stiffly, sensing the power shift happening in real time as the usual formula of The View controlled chaos. Fast-paced debate and strategic interruptions was failing. And Freeman? He was still sitting there perfectly composed, waiting for them to come back. The screen flashed, the music played. And just like that, they were back on air. Whoopi cleared her throat, her tone carefully measured as she spoke. We had to take a quick break, but let's get back to it. Her attempt at normalcy felt forced, and the audience could feel it. Joy Behar jumped in quickly, her voice overly casual as she said, Morgan, you're making some interesting points here, but don't you think there's been significant progress? I mean, you yourself are one of the most respected actors in Hollywood. Doesn't that prove things have changed? Freeman chuckled, shaking his head slightly as he responded with precision. Let me ask you something, he said, his tone even. If one man climbs out of a hole, does that mean the hole is gone? Silence followed, and for the first time, The View felt like it had lost control of the conversation entirely. Look, he continued, I've had opportunities. But the truth is, I shouldn't be the exception. His words carried weight, settling over the studio like a heavy fog. The stories that get told, who gets to be hero, who gets to be remembered, those decisions aren't made by the audience. They're made by executives, by networks, by the people who control what gets seen and what gets buried. The audience was hanging on his every word, and Whoopi leaned in, her voice softer now, as she asked, "So, what do you think needs to change?" Freeman met her gaze without hesitation and answered with 3 simple words: "Tell the whole story." The simplicity of his response made the moment hit even harder, and the studio was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Joy Behar shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly trying to regain her footing in the discussion. "Well, I mean, media is a business, right?" she said, forcing a smile. "Networks produce what sells." Freeman tilted his head slightly, letting the moment breathe before delivering his next line. "Or they sell what they produce," he replied, his tone even and unshaken. Another murmur rippled through the audience, the energy in the room shifting yet again. "You tell people the same kinds of stories over and over. They start thinking that's all there is," Freeman continued. "That's how history gets rewritten right in front of us." His gaze swept the panel. And then he asked the question that no one was prepared to answer. "And when someone tries to tell the truth, what happens?" The audience got it. The viewers at home got it. And judging by the way Whoopi exhaled sharply, she got it too. But the View wasn't ready for this conversation. They had already cut him off once, and the question now was, would they dare do it again? Because if they did, it wouldn't just be an awkward transition this time. It would be proof that the media wasn't just shaping narratives. It was actively protecting them. And Morgan Freeman had just forced them to show their hand. The moment the View producers had dreaded was unfolding in real time. Morgan Freeman had backed them into a corner, and the audience could feel it. The viewers at home could feel it. And most importantly, the internet was already reacting. Let Freeman Speak wasn't just trending, it was dominating, with clips of his unfiltered remarks going viral. Social media flooded with captions like "Freeman just schooled Hollywood in 5 minutes and the View tried to silence him. Big mistake." But despite the pressure mounting online, the show's hosts still thought they could regain control. That was their final mistake. Joy Behar, desperate to shift the tone, forced a laugh and said, "Well, Morgan, I think we can all agree that representation matters. I mean, look at how much things have changed over the years." Freeman tilted his head slightly, letting the moment breathe before replying. "Change for who?" he asked, his voice steady and firm. Silence followed as he let the question settle over the panel, his gaze sweeping the room like a slow-moving storm. "Because if you're only looking at the surface," he continued, "at the handful of black actors who have made it, at the occasional film that gets it right, you might think things have changed. But the reality is, the system hasn't. It's just gotten better at pretending." The audience murmured in agreement, their whispers growing louder. Whoopi Goldberg, caught between her instincts as a Hollywood insider and her respect for Freeman, hesitated before speaking. "I hear you, Morgan," she said carefully, "but let's be honest, progress takes time. These things don't happen overnight." Freeman exhaled, his voice measured, and then asked a question that no one could answer. "How much time?" Whoopi blinked, her composure slipping for the first time. "I've been in this industry for decades," Freeman continued, his voice cutting through the tension. "And I've been having the same conversation since the beginning." He leaned forward slightly, his words deliberate and sharp. "How much longer do people need to wait? Another decade? Another 50 years? Or do we finally start asking why we're still waiting at all?" The tension in the studio was thick. And then it happened. A voice crackled over the producers' headsets, giving the order they had all been dreading. "We need to cut this. Now." A sharp cue was given to the floor manager, and in an instant, the screen faded to black. A commercial break hit without warning, and the audience gasped in shock. This wasn't a natural transition, it was a desperate move. And to anyone watching, it looked exactly like what it was: an attempt to silence him. And that was the moment everything changed forever. The audience gasped as the screen faded to black, cutting Freeman off for the second time. The abruptness of the transition sent shockwaves through the studio, confirming what everyone already suspected. This wasn't about taking a break. This was about shutting him down before he could say anything else that might challenge the carefully crafted narratives Hollywood protected. For a split second, there was silence, thick and uneasy. And then the room erupted into murmurs, whispers, and growing frustration. Inside the control room, chaos unfolded as producers scrambled to contain the situation. Who gave that order? One demanded, glaring at the tech team. Another producer, voice tight with panic, muttered, "We didn't have a choice, he was making us look bad." A third chimed in, their voice low but sharp. That just made it worse. Now it looks like we're scared of what he has to say. But it was already too late to fix it. The internet had seen everything, and they weren't about to let it go. Within seconds, Twitter exploded with outrage, and the hashtag Let Freeman Speak dominated the trending list. Viewers at home weren't fooled by the sudden break, and their anger spread like wildfire across social media. They just cut him off again. "This is straight up censorship," one user tweeted. Another post, already gaining thousands of shares, read, "Morgan Freeman is dropping truth bombs, and The View can't handle it." Comment sections were flooded with accusations that the show had just proven everything Freeman had been saying. Back in the studio, the energy had shifted, and not in the way the hosts had hoped. Whoopi Goldberg pressed her lips together, glancing toward the producers for direction. Joy Behar, usually quick with a joke, looked stiff, adjusting her mic in an attempt to act casual. Sunny Hostin shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking between Freeman and the control room. Alyssa Farah Griffin, silent until now, leaned forward slightly, sensing the moment was too big to ignore. But Morgan Freeman, he hadn't moved an inch. When the show returned from break, the atmosphere was tense, and everyone felt it. Whoopi's voice was measured, but not quite steady. "We had to take a quick break, but we're back now with the legendary Morgan Freeman." The way she emphasized quick break was almost a plea, as if trying to convince the audience there was nothing unusual about what had just happened. But Freeman's slight smirk made it clear that he knew otherwise. He leaned forward, his deep voice cutting through the room. "That was quick." Alyssa Farah Griffin sensed the tension and finally spoke up, trying to steer the conversation back. "Morgan, before the break, you were saying something really important about waiting for change." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully, not wanting to get caught in the fire. "Do you think Hollywood will ever truly shift?" Freeman barely paused before responding. "Not unless they're forced to." The audience erupted into applause, a reaction that sent a ripple of discomfort through the panel. Joy Behar, desperate to regain control, forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Well, Morgan, come on, things aren't that bad. I mean, look at you, you've had an incredible career." She gestured toward him, her smile tight, trying to redirect the conversation. "Doesn't that prove things have changed?" Freeman didn't blink, his expression unwavering. "You don't measure progress by the success of a few," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You measure it by the opportunity for all." The applause was deafening, but inside of BC headquarters, there was no celebrating. Executives watched from their offices, grim-faced, as social media continued to explode. Emails flooded in from advertisers, some demanding answers, others already threatening to pull sponsorships. "This is bad," one executive muttered, pacing the floor. Another responded, their voice tight, "We're not in control of this narrative anymore." But the real problem was much worse. Morgan Freeman wasn't just winning the moment, he was winning the entire conversation. Inside the control room, producers were scrambling, trying to figure out how to end this segment without making it even worse. "We have to wrap this up," one of them urged, already seeing the headlines forming. "If we let this go on, we'll lose all control." Another producer shook their head, eyes fixed on the monitors. "It's already too late," they muttered under their breath. "We already lost it." Meanwhile, back on set, Whoopi Goldberg tried one last time to salvage the show. "Morgan, I hear you," she said, her voice soft or measured. "But let's be honest, progress takes time. These things don't happen overnight." She gave a small smile, hoping to diffuse the situation. Freeman exhaled, his patience unwavering. "How much time?" Whoopi blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I've been in this industry for decades," Freeman continued, cutting through the last layer of pretense. "And I've been having the same conversation since the beginning." He paused, letting his words settle into the silence. "So how much longer are people supposed to wait? Another decade? Another 50 years? Or do we finally start asking why we're still waiting at all?" The studio was dead silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Then, just like before, a voice crackled over the producers' headsets. "Cut it! Cut it now!" A sharp cue was given to the floor manager, and in an instant, the screen faded to black again. This time, the audience reacted instantly, gasping and murmuring among themselves. What had once been suspicion was now certainty. View was actively trying to silence him. If the first commercial break had been suspicious, this one was undeniable. Within minutes, Twitter imploded, and major news outlets picked up the story. They just cut Morgan Freeman off again, one tweet read, amassing thousands of shares within minutes. Another post, even more damning, stated, "The View just proved what we've all known. No, Hollywood controls the narrative, and they're terrified of losing that control." The backlash wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. Inside ABC, executives were in full crisis mode, holding emergency meetings. "We need to release a statement," one insisted, pacing furiously. Another shot back, "What can we even say? If we admit we cut him off, we look guilty. If we deny it, no one will believe us." The worst part, Morgan Freeman still hadn't said a word about it. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any statement they could craft. Back in the dressing rooms of The View, tension was suffocating. Whoopi Goldberg sat scrolling through Twitter, her expression unreadable. Joy Behar paced the room, mumbling to herself about how this was all being blown out of proportion. Sunny Hostin set her phone down, her voice barely above a whisper. "This feels different." And she was right. ABC was running out of options, and the whispers had started. Could someone at The View be sacrificed to save the show? Would it be Whoopi? Would it be Joy? Or was The View itself on the verge of collapse? And as the chaos peaked, Morgan Freeman finally broke his silence. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't issue a statement. He simply posted one sentence on social media: "Telling the truth isn't an act of rebellion." The internet erupted, and ABC knew this wasn't just backlash anymore. This was a reckoning. Morgan Freeman's one sentence shattered everything. Telling the truth isn't an act of rebellion. The post was simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. Within minutes, it had been shared millions of times, spreading across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and even news broadcasts. The internet exploded, dissecting every second of The View's attempt to silence him. It wasn't just viral, it was a movement. And now the question that no one at ABC wanted to face was staring them in the eyes. Had The View just destroyed itself? Inside ABC headquarters, the panic was uncontrollable. Executives scrambled in and out of emergency meetings, trying to contain the growing firestorm. Some argued that issuing an apology might help, but others warned that admitting fault would be corporate suicide. "If we apologize, we're admitting we silenced him," one executive muttered. "And if we say we didn't, no one will believe us." Another snap. Meanwhile, sponsors were already pulling out, some quietly, others very publicly, stating they didn't want to be associated with a show accused of censorship on live television. The biggest problem wasn't just the backlash, it was the silence from Freeman himself. His refusal to do interviews, make public statements, or engage with the controversy only made the story stronger. Every hour that passed without a response from him fueled speculation. Was he preparing to sue? Would he expose even more about how Hollywood manipulates narratives? Could he bring down The View entirely? No one at ABC knew the answer, and that was terrifying. Back into The View's dressing rooms, the atmosphere was suffocating. Whoopi Goldberg sat silently, staring at her phone, scrolling through comments that called her complicit in the censorship. Joy Behar paced the room, muttering about how the audience was overreacting. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "People get cut off in interviews all the time." But Sunny Hostin wasn't convinced. "This is different," she murmured. "This isn't just about the show anymore. It's about trust." Alyssa Farrar Griffin, always the observer, leaned against the counter, watching her co-host unravel. She knew what was coming. Behind closed doors, ABC executives were making decisions, and not everyone was going to survive this. The question wasn't if someone would take the fall, it was who. Firing Whoopi would be a media disaster, as she was the face of the show. Letting Joy go might temporarily satisfy the outrage, but would it be enough? Or was this the moment ABC finally admitted the truth? That The View was too broken to fix. Inside the control room, producers tried to prepare for the next show, but the damage couldn't be ignored. Live chat sections on ABC's website were flooded with angry viewers demanding answers. Why won't they talk about cutting Freeman off? Where's the apology? Guess we know who really controls the media. Every attempt to move on from the controversy only made it worse. The final straw came when an internal ABC memo leaked. The memo revealed that ABC had been worried about The View's declining credibility for years, and that Freeman's interviews, it just accelerated the inevitable. In one damning sentence, the memo stated, "If we don't regain audience trust immediately, The View may not survive the year. Within minutes, the document went viral and ABC executives were forced into a corner. By the time the next episode of The View aired, the audience was ready for blood. Whoopi Goldberg's usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced with a tense, uncertain smile. Joy Behar looked exhausted, her usual quick wit noticeably absent. Sunny Hostin and Alyssa Farah Griffin sat stiffly, sensing the shift. The cameras rolled and the world was waiting. Would they acknowledge what happened? Or would they pretend it never did? Whoopi cleared her throat, forcing a smile. We want to take a moment to address some of the conversations that have been happening online, she began. But before she could finish, the audience erupted in boos. Live television had never seen anything like it. ABC cut the audience's mics, but the damage was already done. As the backlash grew, ABC was out of time. Executives had one last move, and they took it. Within 24 hours, a statement was released. The View will be undergoing a major restructuring. Certain panelists will not be returning. They didn't say who was getting fired. They didn't say why, but everyone already knew. The next morning, reports confirmed it. Joy Behar was out. She had been let go quietly in an attempt to quell the outrage. The decision was supposed to save the show, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of calming the storm, it proved Freeman right Hollywood didn't just control narratives, it protected them at all costs. And now, The View had become the perfect example. Even with Joy Behar gone, the damage couldn't be undone. Ratings plummeted, audience trust collapsed, and advertisers hesitated to return. The View tried everything, new panelists, different discussion formats, even bringing in guest moderators, but nothing worked. The controversy had left a permanent stain, one that no rebranding could erase. Behind the scenes, ABC made the hardest decision yet. If The View couldn't be saved, then maybe it was time to end it altogether. A final meeting was called, and the verdict was clear. The network had to cut their losses. And just like that, after decades on the air, ABC pulled the plug. The official announcement was carefully worded. After many successful years, The View will be concluding its run as we continue to evolve our programming. But the audience knew the truth. The show wasn't evolving. It had been destroyed by its own choices. When the final episode aired, it was strangely quiet. There were no farewell montages, no grand celebrations. Whoopi, Sunny, and Alyssa gave their final thoughts, but there was no mention of why the show was really ending. The cameras rolled. The credits played. And just like that, The View was gone. While all of this unfolded, Morgan Freeman remained silent. He never gave interviews about what happened. He never issued a statement beyond his single post. He didn't need to. His silence was more powerful than any argument. The world had seen what happened. And for once, Hollywood couldn't rewrite the story. Weeks after The View's cancellation, Freeman was spotted at an event, walking past a crowd of reporters. One journalist, desperate for a comment, called out, "Mr. Freeman, do you have anything to say about what happened?" He stopped, looked directly into the camera, and smiled. "I already said everything I needed to." And then he walked away. The fall of The View became one of the biggest media stories of the decade. It wasn't just about one interview gone wrong, it was about a broken system finally being exposed. The show that had silenced voices for years had finally been silenced itself. And for the first time, Hollywood had to face the truth. The audience had spoken. And this time, there was nothing the media could do to stop it. This story isn't just about The View. It isn't just about Hollywood. It's about control. It's about power. And most importantly, it's about truth, who gets to tell it, who gets to hear it, and who decides what gets buried. Morgan Freeman didn't yell. He didn't argue. He didn't beg to be heard. He simply spoke the truth and watched as the system panicked, stumbled, and collapsed under the weight of its own lies. That's the power of truth. It doesn't need to scream. It doesn't need to fight. It just needs to exist, and when the moment is right, it will stand undefeated. Think about the world we live in. Every day, people in power shape what we see, what we know, and what we believe. They feed us the same stories, the same distractions, the same comfortable illusions, and most people, they accept it. Not because they're weak, but because they don't realize there's another way. But here's the truth. They don't want you to know. You are not powerless. You are not voiceless. You have the ability to question what you're told, to challenge the narratives fed to you, and to demand the full picture, not just a version that makes others comfortable. When the truth is spoken, those who fear it will try to silence it. They will cut the mic, change the subject, and rewrite history in real time. But no matter how hard they try, the truth has a way of breaking through. So here's the lesson: never let fear stop you from speaking the truth. Never let someone else decide what you're allowed to know. And most of all, never mistake silence for defeat. Because when the truth finally comes out, it doesn't just expose the lie, it ends it.